Okay, right, this will be interesting. For those, I think
That's close to judge.
yes. Perhaps that's interesting in the way I originally thought. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Korycki. I've been sort of part of SCiO for 10 years, roughly, in some way or another, after Patrick introduced those of us involved in the Chartered Quality Institute Deming Special Interest Group to beer and DSM. I've been in BT for 37 years, those who met me in the earlier section discovered. I'm part of global services, I'm customer service, so I spend a lot of time grappling with this thing called ITIL. I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then Steve's going to talk a little bit about cybernetics, loops, how those relate to ITIL. So that it kind of has two pieces. So I thought if we were going to talk about cybernetic loops in ITIL, we should, I suppose, tell you a little bit about what ITIL is first, before everyone goes, what the hell's that? So, I mean, essentially, it's a thing called the IT Infrastructure Library. It was created somewhere between 1989 and 96 in terms of it being published. And originally derived from the UK government, the old CCTA agency. And it's a collection of practice guidance. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that in a minute. But essentially it has a number of elements. So there's a strategy bit, there's an operations bit, there's a design bit, there's what's called a transition bit. And all of this was originally designed to try and improve the way that organisations managing IT for government operated. So there's no difference in a way to how this has grown up in something like ISO 9001, which was trying to get quality into manufacturing or quality into operation. This just happens to apply to ITIL. We had a slightly different journey. It's when you start looking at it, it's actually quite complex. So you've got things that are very obvious, like there's an event somewhere in my service, I'm going to raise an incident because I've got a problem, I have a request for something, or there's a problem that we're going to try and resolve, or I need access to something. There's a piece in strategy which is about sort of generation, portfolio strategy, or the sort of portfolio strategy, financial strategy, demand strategy. I have to say this part of the ITIL framework is sort of very broad and a bit focused on IT. It's not really holistic, but it's kind of focused just on that one area. There's a section around continual improvement that's around measurement, reporting and improvement. It's very, again, generic, not an awful lot of method in there. In a way, its vagueness sort of helps it from, saves it from condemnation, but that's also part of its problem as well. Its vagueness isn't actually totally usable. There's a whole section here about design, about how you actually manage for availability and capacity in a solution that you're giving to a customer or to your own organisation. And there's a piece around planning and transition of different elements of IT. So you're planning it, you're changing it, you're configuring it, you're managing releases of, say, applications or facilities, you're validating, and there's an evaluation piece and there's a knowledge piece that's sort of a bit buried. It's not really knowledge management. There is talk in it all about knowledge management, but actually it's kind of fairly mechanical and pretty much codified knowledge. There are books and there are courses, and they go on forever. And you can become a sort of certified practitioner of ITIL as a piece of guidance. So it's really, even though it started in the IT world in the UK, it very quickly spread out. So nowadays, if you go to multinational corporations in, somewhere in Maryland in the US, they'll say, well, are you ITIL? So it's even though it started in a small way, it's one of those things that kind of people grab and say, well, I haven't got anything, so this is a good thing for me to use. That's kind of like the framework. So if you want to think about it, you can just think of it as it is a collection of guidance documents and a framework, and it's a sort of normative model. One should try to do this. This is a good way of trying to do this stuff. Important to note, it's not holistic. It is not attempting to take a broad view of the whole organisation. It's not an enterprise model, and it's not a process architecture either, so you start asking, well, how does it fit? And that raises issues about how it works. So you cannot use it to create a model of your organisation from either a process context or an enterprise context. Even more frustrating for some people, it's not actually a standard, even though people do talk about someone being ITIL compliant. There is no such thing. You cannot be compliant to ITIL because it's just guidance. You can be compliant to ISO standard 20,000, which is the only form of ITIL where they've taken the range of books and essentially boiled it down into about a 30-page document with clauses in it that auditors can wander around an organisation and go, do they do this or do they not do this adequately? So it is dangerous in that some people do say, you know, are you compliant to ITIL, but you can't actually. And the ISO 20000 standard is much closer to the bog standard ISO 9001 quality standard, where you can actually go into an organisation and audit. One of the deficiencies of this gap is that there's an awful lot of stuff in ITIL which is not in ISO 20000. So when you go and say, is an organisation compliant to the ISO standard, you miss a heck of a lot of the richness that's in the guidance. But then you actually can't, as I said, you can't audit the guidance because it is so large and complex. One of the interesting things that it was originally designed to try and apply to internal organisations, i.e. the IT department providing services to the organisation. It has rapidly expanded so that, you know, for example, BT, particularly the services part, we have customers who say, do you do ITIL? Are your processes ITIL? Do you follow the guidance? Do you certify to ISO 20000? Even though, of course, we're not part of their organisation, we're providing a facility managed solution for them. So it can then apply to any network of external suppliers, from a single supplier to multiple ones. So there are ones perhaps where we've got someone like Fujitsu or Hewlett-Packard and BT all collaborating together as a network. We do the telecoms, other people are doing the IT and so on. And the customer will typically go, I want you to do, you know, I want you all to be ITIL. And it can apply to any combination of information and I would say established communications technology. And there's a reason why I use the word established, because there's some gaps that appear later on. But very much kind of like the network part of an application and how it operates in an organisation you can apply it all to. And as I said, it's frequently required by multinational corporations and UK and US government, and there are additional expectations relating to ITIL process content and governance from other standards as well. So quite often ITIL doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not the only thing that these organisations are asking for. They could be asking for ISO 9001 quality standard, ITIL, SARBOX, financial standard, various other bits all wrapped around it. If you're dealing with anyone who deals with food in America, you get the Food and Drug Administration overlay, or in some cases telecoms, you get the FCC in America. So you get, so it's not a clean space. It's very messy. It's very overlapped. ITIL, in fact, inside itself overlaps itself. The moment you start winding it in with ISO 9001, then you get all sorts of overlaps and conflicts. So it is not the most easy thing to apply in a large, complex organisation. The more complex it gets, the harder it is. So some problems, and there are problems, and we shouldn't pretend that it is perfect, because it isn't, Patrick.
Tony, just on the last slide, have you got any idea how, sort of what proportion of public sector in the UK
would demand it?
Demands it.
Most of it.
All of it. Okay.
Pretty much most of it.
All of it, okay.
Yeah, we're quite good at asking for things we don't really want.
I mean, just add to what Tony said, I mean, this might seem obscure, but every single company in the UK has IT. This therefore potentially applies to every single company.
And probably there are some smaller organisations that, you know, maybe some of the kind of councils and stuff don't necessarily go that hell for leather for it. The bigger they get, the closer you get to central government departments, the MOD, DWP, anything like that, they just want it because they want to secure that services they're being given match some kind of good guidance practice. And that's really what it's about. So there are gaps in ITIL to start with, because it's an IT-oriented thing, and it's oriented originally from IT infrastructure, build, develop, operate. Organisations attempt to use ITIL as a framework. And at that point, you kind of fall down a number of black holes, because there's nothing in ITIL about bids, sales, billing, even complex service requests is kind of like bodgily handled by calling it projects and other things. And at worst, some aspects of ITIL are bods to try and address wider needs. So, for example, you cannot take the strategy bit of ITIL and say that's strategy for the organisation. It's only really strategy for IT. So you have to be very careful about how you apply it. Customers of ITIL frequently misinterpret the expectations of ITIL, or maintain approaches that are actually old versions. So we've still got, in BT, customers who come to us and say, we want you to do change management. And when we ask them what change management is, they have a meaning of it that's about 5 or 6 or 7 years old, whereas actually ITIL has moved on and actually made and realised that it had to break change management up into service request management and change management, because the old version of change management was heavy and clunky and expensive, but customers still ask for the old version because they haven't caught up with the reality of where it's got. That makes it very difficult for any organisation sometimes to apply a single consistent version across a shared service function, because you've got customers who call things different names but mean different things, or sometimes call things different things, call them different names but actually mean the same thing. So you kind of get that kind of meshing of requirements. It has a partial overlap with other frameworks such as ETOM, which is the telecommunications model, or TOGAF, and although it maps, there are bits of ITIL which not only kind of semi-conflict between itself, but don't quite map nicely to other things. The reason I said that it kind of maps to established telecom services is that it hasn't really adapted to things like agile. So ITIL doesn't fit nicely with, if you're trying to do an agile developed organisation or IT, ITIL's mindset is still very old-fashioned, but it was written by CCTA, so it hasn't really caught up. And neither of it seems to be capable of dealing with cloud computing. So back to your story, Trevor, about Amazon Web Services. You wouldn't want to go back to Amazon and say you really need to do ITIL, because they go, ugh, because it doesn't really fit. And there are all sorts of requirements that come in cloud around self-service, around agility, right, dynamic network services, that really don't fit very well. The whole idea of self-service is not really covered by ITIL at all. It doesn't understand it. Similarly, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding or little or no understanding about how ITIL can coexist with systems thinking approaches in organisations that are attempting to use any aspect of systems thinking whatsoever. So as you can imagine, it's this great big thing that's grown and morphed and been required, but quite often there isn't that understanding of how it interacts with viable systems or any other systems thinking approach to an organisation. And at that point I was going to stop and hand over to Steve, who will talk a little bit about how you can make some sense out of this.
You're going to find me my presentation.
I have a presentation.
It's almost seamless, isn't it?
It's good, wasn't it? Yeah.
It didn't surprise me, yeah.
Not about the best place to stand this, but so I'm Steve Hales. I've also been involved with SCiO for a number of years, but this interest in ITIL kind of lies in between my involvements, in that SCiO gave me my first look at organisational design. Organisational design was what I got into in my second career, working in IT service management, initially with EDS and then later HP, who took them over. And having been made redundant from HP, I then went and did the ITIL expert course, which is kind of shutting the stable door, because I haven't done anything with it since, other than this. So I worked on the DWP account, I worked on the MOD account, big government agencies using ITIL. And ITIL completely flummoxed me. I mean, for a start, there are a lot of books, and I'm not someone who's really into documents. I like drawings. So I tried to make sense of these processes in these books, and I did a lot of drawings. And most of my drawings had loops in them because I'd done the system stuff. So that's the origin of why I got interested in this. And since leaving HP, we've put together an ITIL common interest group looking at ITIL and systems thinking, which we call Reframing ITIL. And we're trying to put a book together. I reckon we're about 2/3 of the way through that now. And the first part of it is looking at these loops. So in this talk, what I want to talk a little bit about, I want to remind you about cybernetic loops and get you to tell me about them. Then I'm going to talk about ITIL operational processes. These are the simplest processes. They've been in ITIL since the beginning, and they're still there. They're the ones that almost every organisation does implement, whereas there's an awful lot of stuff they don't. And I'm going to go on and explain how we can use the cybernetic understanding to identify some of the stuff that's missing. Right, what I need to do now is work out. Right, so I'm going to start off talking about cybernetic loops. So most of you will know this better than me, and I would be grateful if you'll clarify points that I miss. So first of all, the basic cybernetic loop. We've got an operation going on, and the purpose of the loop, the feedback loop, I know they hate the term, but is to make sure that that operation stays within boundaries, within parameters. And the way to do that is to take measurements of the output from the operation, to compare them to a standard, and then if they're deviating from the standard, to affect the input so that they feed back, so that the operation is brought back in line with where it should be. The problem with that, of course, is that if there's a time delay between the measurement and the input, or the development of the output, you can produce an accelerating deviation, and the beer game, for those of you who will have played it, is essentially about that, explaining how that happens. And you can get a nasty runaway effect, as shown in this diagram, taken straight out of the heart of organisation. The way around that is to put in a feedback adjuster, which builds a delay into the system so that the control is more effective. And an example is of a house thermostat regulating temperature in a house. Now, that doesn't generally have a feedback adjuster because there is no serious time delay in it. But that, I think, is a fair example, simple example of a stability loop. Then there is an adaptability loop. So if the system is not managing to stay within the boundaries, you need to do something to the control so that the system can. An example for the thermostat would be to reset the temperature. Maybe the thermostat wasn't keeping the temperature within the range, too many drafts, so you have to lower the thermostat to keep it in line. That would be an example of a second adaptability loop operating on the basic thermostatic loop. And this is adjusting using an adjuster controller. There's then a transformation loop which can be applied, which is another larger scale change to the system. So here we'd be talking about replacing the thermostat or even the central heating system. There's a hint in those two examples. One of them is relatively easy and cheap, the other is enormously expensive. You'll see that range of change in a transformation loop later on. So that is the three loops that I'm considering as the cybernetic control loops. All of these loops, as I've given them as an example, are essentially dealing with something quantitative coming out of the operation. That isn't always the case and isn't necessarily the case. Those are the three loops. There's an additional fact here which I didn't mention before, which is this management level. If you're going for transformation, you have to go up a management level. Why do you do that? Because you need extra resource, and you won't get that unless you get it approved at a higher level. So your lower management level can manage quite happily the operation, the stability loop, the adaptability loop, but if you want to do a transformation, you need to go higher. And just as an aside, for those of you familiar with Argyris's double loop learning, I think this is how the double loop and the single loop learning compare to the two larger of the cybernetic loops. That makes sense to you. So the adaptability and single loop learning are analogous, and the transformation of double loop learning are analogous. So, ITIL. This is a different version of the diagram which Tony put up, showing the 25 or so processes that ITIL describes. ITIL is not in any sense an academic work, and these are not all processes. Some of them are capabilities, some of them are repositories. A very small number of them are actually processes. They cover the whole area that an IT support organisation will work in, but as Tony correctly said, they do not cover all aspects of it, so they're probably only covering a third, quarter of what is needed to run that organisation. What we're most interested in is the operational processes for this particular investigation, although elsewhere in the work we're doing in the ITIL SIG, we are looking at all the others. So we're looking at these 5 processes here. 3 of them, incident and event management and problem management, are what I call fault-driven. That is, if something goes wrong with the process, and these are about correcting it. And 2 of them, request management and access management, are user-driven. So the user wants something to happen. So let's look at those briefly. Starting off with incident management and event management, we're looking here at a stability loop. The comparison that is made, if it's made by a user, is between their expectation of the system working or working in a certain way and the fact that it's not. And they would typically contact a contact desk, a support desk of some form, and they would get a number of potential responses, all of which are aimed at fixing their particular issue. They're not, this incident management is not about mending something, it's about fixing the issue that the user has as quickly as possible. It doesn't matter whether that has any wider effect or not. So the first thing that they might be doing to fix their problem would be to look at information. So they might be going online, or they might be given some information which tells them, well, actually, that's not how you do it like this. Problem solved. If that isn't the case, then someone may come on and play with your computer remotely and fix it. And you've got a series, first, second, third line, of different levels of expertise that you can access. So as you can imagine, the majority would be fixed at first line, some of them are too hard, and they go to second line, they would have a go, and eventually you get to third line. Sometimes third line would be a third party. But the aim is always to fix the problem and get the operation back on course again. So that's incident management. Event management is very similar, but instead of the user detecting the problem, an automated system detects the problem. And usually there you are dealing with something quantitative, so it might be the capacity of the system is going down and everything's slowing down. The system detects that and it brings more resource online. So it's fixed before the user is even aware of it. So this is incident management. Now there's another loop, which, as you can see in the top right, I've identified as an adaptability loop. This is problem management. This time we're not trying to fix something in the sense that we're leaving the system as it was. We're trying to change the system so that it's more effective. The problem management collects data either from the system or it analyses trends in incidents, and after a selection of which ones to look at, a team usually would try and find the root cause. Having found the root cause, they can either fix the problem, which is actually not what they usually do because it's too hard normally. They might change the standard. So, for example, if the problem has come about because the system is always running too slow, the simple thing you do is you change the standard so that you expect the system to run too slowly, a bit the way that trains build in delay to their timetables. And the other thing they do, which is also very common, is they could do something called a known error. And a known error is basically, we know it doesn't work, but we're not going to do anything about it. So we'll put it on the database that this doesn't work, and then everybody will be happy. And the reason you do that is usually it's going to be too expensive to fix, or maybe it's somebody else's problem. Microsoft did it, we can't do anything about it, sorry mate, you're going to have to live with it. That's a known error, very, very common. And the other output is a recommendation for a piece of work to rebuild whatever is causing the problem. So that is the adaptability loop on the stability loop in the fault-driven space. Moving on to user-driven. What do we mean by user-driven? Well, this is where somebody wants something enhanced. Usually they want more of something. If it's a user, they want a new laptop, they want a piece of software installed. That would be a standard request. You're all used to standard requests. You buy things off Amazon, that's a standard request. You're buying something, someone has decided what it's going to cost, it's up there, you click. If you're lucky, it's delivered pretty quickly. And that's exactly what a standard request is in IT terms. And they're defined in a contract, the money is sometimes arranged up front, etc., etc. Access management is very similar. It's equally frequently done online by the user. You go in, you change your password, you go in, you request a new user. So access management and standard requests are very, very similar and very simple. They're essentially a stability loop to keep the system running in a very slightly modified way. There's something else that happens. Oh, I don't want a Dell laptop. I want an Apple laptop. Hands go up in horror, of course. That is a non-standard request. And if it's allowed, something then has to happen. But it's not usually a case of we'll order the Apple laptop. It's usually a case of a lot of testing has to be done to see if it will work, see if the security will work, see if the software will work before it's delivered. So the non-standard request has implications for change management, has implications for cost, implications for resource. The reality...
do you mind, just a quick thing, what's just shouting out at me from this, and it may come up later,
Yeah?
is that there is no algebraic signalling where things are shooting up through the hierarchy without being processed by level 1, level 2, level 3, and that it's mostly people in levels of seniority who want the Apple laptop rather than based on organisational need.
That is true. And there was a wonderful case in HP when we had a new CEO came in, and he was an Apple man, and everybody else was using Microsoft, and he insisted that he'd be allowed to have Apple, and it changed the whole underlying structure of the IT in the organisation because he wanted to use his Apple Mac. Mind-boggling. But that's the way it goes.
Actually, it was interesting for that because I know that we had exactly the same problem in BT. You know about that problem code.
I'm sure it's like...
We invented a new approach called bring your own device.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, you could. You had to have BT's security software on, but you could take an Apple device and bring it in.
It's an acronym now, BYOD.
BYOD. Please bring your own device. But it worked. We adapted.
So non-standard requests in reality vary from just not quite a standard request, like I would like a pink mouse. I don't know if you can get pink mice, but yeah, I think you can too.
Somebody's got on them as well.
So everything from I would like a pink mouse right the way through to, you know, I need this unit completely reinstalling with a different WAN infrastructure, but isn't quite big enough to be a project. So you get this range from standard requests. Sorry, if I draw here, you can't see any. From standard requests right the way up, massive different costs. Non-standard requests are not part of ITIL. That's a problem because a lot of IT outsourcers don't have a method for non-standard requests. So if it's not a standard request, it has to be a project. So imagine you put in a request for a pink mouse and it becomes a project. And it has a project manager assigned. And it costs a lot of money, a lot more money than a pink mouse. So the implication of not having a process called non-standard requests in ITIL is huge, huge, huge expense. And I was on an account with E.ON where this actually was costing them millions in the first 2 or 3 months because their list of non-standard items was far too small and they didn't have a method for doing anything other than projects if it wasn't a standard item. And almost everything was coming in as non-standard. So not having a process can be somewhat disastrous.
Does that happen because they fail to understand the complexity, their internal complexity?
It comes because the contract was based in ITIL and the faith that ITIL would enable them to provide the service.
So ITIL doesn't enable them to manage the effects of their business effectively.
No.
It's at odds.
Absolutely
That's
not.
one of the points I made about that. So many things about being missing. So for example, when we had to handle it on a lot of our contracts, we invented this thing called a predefined service request.
Yeah.
Which is effectively a catalogued, non-standard item. But as Steve said, until we did that, everything was going through a designer and costing, and you can imagine it was just like cost of that. Was just unbelievable.
There does appear to be a layer, certainly from my experience, missing the IT bit, like what were you using it for and why, that IS bit, so the understanding of what an information system is, and then the IT you need to enable that is completely missing, and we quite often
Yeah.
favour too. So while we use ITIL, but ITIL doesn't explain to you
Correct.
how you do the information systems bit. It assumes you have a well-rounded, well-understood problem space from which you can then do it. So there's a layer missing. ITIL's trying to fill those gaps, but we're
Yeah.
very poorly.
The problem
But it's-
explodes when you get into telecom services on top of the IT as well.
ITIL was developed pragmatically by non-systems thinkers, and although reading these massive 5 books, you find the odd diagram that looks as though a systems thinker put it in. They're very, very much in the minority.
Steve, sorry, you used an interesting phrase just there about people's faith in ITIL. Do you have a sense of why it's become so ubiquitous and why so many people have faith in it?
Because it's a large scale standard which very large companies can use which large companies insist on for outsourcers to have. It's so that staff are transferable more readily.
How did it get to that stage?
It was grabbed by organisations that saw, well, hold on, I've got the same problem.
It's just lack of alternative.
There wasn't a practice guide.
It's not bad.
No,
It's not a bad system.
ITIL's a bit like the quotes about democracy, you know, rather than the system, it's the least worst option kind of thing. And at the time when it was a bit more Wild West, you needed a standard, something, even if it wasn't perfect, you could move staff from one company to another and take their experience with them. So it's just a standard.
There are better systems.
Be careful, it's not a standard.
No, it's not.
Sorry?
It's not a standard.
But
It's
it's
a set of guidelines.
Like TCP/IP, the ISO. You
No,
know,
it's not a standard. It's a
I know
collection
it's-
of guides. ISO 20000 is a standard. ITIL is not. And
Yes.
never will be.
But it is
Yeah.
a standard, it's not
but
a
it's
standard,
the
isn't it?
standard
Yeah.
that
It
is
is,
the
it's
standard.
a set of practice guidelines. You have to
Yes.
think about it like that. The moment you start thinking up with a standard, you actually tie yourself
It
in knots.
confuses people, and there's some comfort. Oh, ITIL, everyone's heard of ITIL, that ITIL must be okay.
Mm.
And that kind of myth gets promulgated in the sense that
Yes.
it's used out with its context,
But
and in a way it was never intended to, without understanding all the implications doing so. If you understand its limitations, happy days.
Yes.
If you don't, you're in a bit of a hiding.
Yeah.
And
There
it's
are
a
also-
lines blanket, Steve, you know, it gives the veneer of that all this mess is under control.
yeah.
There's nothing recursive about ITIL, and there's a lot of other problems with it, but that's one of the issues.
It's
But there are probably better systems. I mean, the Dutch use a better system, but it's not very widespread. And I don't know whether they will persevere. So, carrying on, so far we've looked at 5 of the operational processes which represent 3 types of loop. So this is the space that we've so far been able to populate in terms of cybernetic loops from ITIL. Using the approach and looking at what else goes on, and this is based on experience of what goes on in IT service management organisations, there are a number of other things, as you might expect. The first one on the left is that the transformation loops do exist, and they are described in continual service improvement. Not very well, but they are, and obviously they do. All IT organisations have large projects, transformation projects. So they are there, they are in ITIL, they're not described as a process. I think improvement is probably capability rather than a process. And that is in the fault-driven space. In the user-driven space, as I say, we have standard requests and access in the orange box. We then have non-standard requests. We also have transformational requests. So there are 2 other loops there in the user-driven space. And then there's a third space, and there may be fourth and fifth that I haven't identified, in the supplier-driven, proactive. So this is where software or hardware is being updated. And basically the stability loop is patching. It's patching or supplying material into a store whereby people order things.
Steve, is it ever getting into the fact that some of those user-driven problems will be people behavioural problems rather than
Yes.
hardware IT?
Yes, and that's where the information comes in, because you're actually saying, well, actually, this is how you should be doing it, and oh, we're doing it wrong. So yes,
So
it's
you identify lack of training or...
yes, the operation is got the user in it as well. It's not just the software hardware network; it's the user as well. Absolutely. So in the back to the supplier driven, we've got the patching, which is the stability loop. We've got refreshing, which is the adaptability loop. So that might be updating from Word 8 to Word 10 or whatever versions you're looking at. It might be changing your laptop from a Dell to an HP. And then you've got renewal, and renewal is a really big thing, because that is where you're talking about something very significant, like changing your accountancy package from one thing to another. It usually has massive cost implications. It might be a whole systems thing, as was going on in MOD. I've even forgotten what the new system is called, but it was what we were putting in.
On net.
No, it was before then.
DII.
Oh, I don't know. DII, yes, DII.
Well, on net makes the II look good, so... that's
Oh, that wouldn't be hard, would it? Let's be honest. We spent 3 years on DII. So renewal is a big thing again. So from understanding the scalability, the fact that these are loops, the fact that there are different initiators of these loops, we can see that instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, which ITIL identifies, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that it doesn't. And if you know about those, you can actually design your organisation to service them. Now, you may not believe it, but a lot of IT support organisations are not designed to service them. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of IT, particularly big companies, is done through outsource. Outsourced organisations are set up like that in the geological timescale. I mean, we're talking about months. So if the people setting them up don't understand what they're doing, they can make some devastating mistakes. Most companies out there on the FTSE 500 have evolved over years, if not decades. And that gives the ones that fail a chance to fail. That doesn't apply in a lot of IT support. So you really have to know what it is you're delivering when you sign those contracts to actually deliver something that's going to make sense and make you money, if that's the game you're in. And I have been on accounts where various of these have been missing, where there has been no refresh renewal process. But if there isn't a process, it doesn't happen. It can't happen. You can't even discuss it. Some of you will have been in that environment in companies where, well, you will have tried it. You'll have tried to complain about something, and it goes nowhere. And it goes nowhere because there isn't a process for it to go anywhere. And the same thing can happen, and it costs a lot of money when it does. So again, these are the control loops. This gives a little bit of more information about the characteristics. And the things I point out are the stability processes tend to be high volume, low value, and quick. So of course they're automated. The standard requests are automated. A lot of the incident stuff is automated. Adaptability processes, medium volume, medium value, medium time scale. Considerably less frequent than the stability process. And transformation, very low volume, but very high value, and frequently long time scale. Sometimes can be many, many years to actually put some of these changes in. And these are the ones that ITIL describes. Sorry, Patrick. Yeah. 5. Oh, I see. Yes, I thought you had a question there. So what is this? What we've done here is we've applied a cybernetic approach to something which was really not terribly exciting. ITIL manages to describe a subset of the control loops operating in ICT delivery and support. By understanding how control loops work and what they are, we were able to predict these others, and knowing these other loops allows us to manage and prevent expensive emissions and mismanagement. This bit of work was the first bit of work in looking at ITIL and VSM and systems approaches, and I think we've taken the other aspects forward quite a long way as well. So if any of this interests you at all, and I notice I can't see anybody actually asleep, but it could be because it's still before lunch. If any of this interests you at all, please do come and see us, because we're interested in people collaborating or reviewing what we're doing. Why is it? I'm excited about this. I'm not very good at projecting excitement, but I am excited about this because this doesn't just apply to IT. It applies to any industry that offers a support service. And do you know what? That's every industry. So ITIL doesn't describe every industry, but the full set probably does. So essentially what we're doing is putting the meat on the bones, for me, of the VSN description of organisations, and providing a lot more things that people can look for and look at. And I apply this laterally. My wife's a mental health social worker, and I find myself applying this stuff to her practice and seeing all the same functions and the same issues: incident management, problem management, request. All of that is there. It's called completely different things, but they're all there, all those loops. And that, to me, is what's exciting about it, and that's the next stage.
I wanted to come back to the point about algorithmic signals in the language of VSM, pain signals that need to go right to the top immediately. But also, correct me if I'm wrong, you presented it almost as if the standard approach in ITIL is tiered help desks with an attempt to triage. And I think there's quite good evidence that depending on the complexity and predictability of demand coming into a service, starting with the lowest paid and least competent people as the first point of contact is a bad idea.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens.
My wife was a graphic designer at TfL,
Yeah.
had a legitimate Mac, and had to ring up and say, my Mac's gone off the IP thing again, you need to put me through to third tier help desk, can you do it? And they said, okay madam, can you reboot your PC?
Yeah.
6 hours later she can work again, you know. Can you speak?
Yes.
Speak to that.
Yes, I mean, because the incidents themselves and the simpler incidents are high volume and usually low complexity, what they do is provide help desk, and the help desk, as you say, are low paid, very high turnover, frequently not highly educated because of the low pay, etc., etc. And it does create that effect. There's been a move to increase first line fixes, and that's done in a number of ways. First of all, because that area is so high volume, there's a lot of automation involved. So good help desks will have a good set of questions that someone who is unqualified can read off the screen and actually get to the right place more quickly, but that is still rare. And in some cases now they're putting higher paid people in so that they can actually deal with the issue online. If you phone an American help desk, which occasionally for my sins I have to do, you will almost certainly get straight through to the person who can fix it rather than going through a help desk, because they do not use ITIL. That's my interpretation.
Interesting.
However, the negative of that is, if that person can't fix it, there's nowhere to go, and they don't have a first, second, third line. So different practices produce different benefits, but absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we found when we looked at this further organisationally is there is no even remotely ideal organisational structure that works for this stuff. You can look at all the different alternative organisational structures, and they all have major, major problems, and you can't entirely solve them by coordination mechanisms and so forth.
Just a quick addendum, there was really good research done in the days of e-government in the 2000s, early 2000s, by a guy called Terry Daly out of Lewisham, with some modelling, proved quite well that there's this just default target, because of Pareto, I guess, of 80% first point of contact resolution, and that was being applied to contact centres for government, and they worked out you don't get any of the organisational benefits or savings until that first point of contact resolution is in the 90 percentiles, and it needs to be a target of about 94% for that range of public sector services.
Right.
Everybody was 80%, which meant that
I've never known a target higher than 60,
Wow.
65-ish,
Okay.
in IT anyway.
And that's a simpler service in many
Well, yeah.
You talked about the loops and some are there and some aren't there. So in your experience, we talked about the frequency of some of those things happening.
Yeah.
Given that some of them we don't know about, therefore the systems and the processes aren't there to measure or even to capture the fact that they're not happening, in your experience, what percentage of activity is happening as it currently stands with the stuff that we know, and what is in those other loops that we're not managing very well? Are the gaps covering a huge amount of work? To tackle that, is the squeeze, is the juice going to be worth the squeeze in terms of majority of things that go wrong or need to be fixed are in those areas that we don't currently cover as part of it all? What's your feel in terms of that kind of, where are the problems, where are the pain points? Is there a huge amount of pain points that the organisation just isn't sensing because it doesn't have a process from your experience? Or actually are they kind of less common?
I think the reason that ITIL's focused on fault-driven and standard requests is that is where the highest volume is. So that's where most of the issues would be if they were not managed by the processes. I'm assuming when I say that the processes are being used properly and are implemented properly, and that is far from the case. And let's assume that they are, they should cover the majority of the issues. So the grade outlines on the right and left top are, I think it takes time. I mean, if you're dealing with a new service, so a new outsourcer coming in or something along those lines, it'd be very, very common for several of those to be either missing or very poorly managed or certainly inadequately resourced.
So the black lines are only ever going to capture the as-is problems.
They'll cover the standard type stuff.
The majority.
And they will cover hopefully what you specified either in what the
In the
internal
contract, yeah.
department is doing or contractually.
By our own admission, quite often we're specifying things we don't understand why we're
Yes.
doing
Yeah.
them. You
But-
talked about double loop learning as well. Just wondering, where's the triple loop version of that?
Yeah,
control loop?
I don't
Is
do
there-
I don't do triple loop.
is that
I
what
don't
it's
like triple loop. If you leave a contract 3 or 4 years in, most of this stuff will be sorted because the pain will have hit them in their pockets and they'll have gone in and they'll have fixed it. Bizarrely, even large companies that have a series of different clients, some of them do it wrong every single time because they don't have a learning loop back into the parent organisation. Others do have a learning loop. I know what that means.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.